Chapter with CRS. And we're going to give it another minute and we will get going. We'll tell you about this campaign and we'll have our speakers and then hopefully hear from some of you with your questions. I really hope some of you out there will have some engagement and we'd love to hear from you based on what you hear from our speakers. All right, it's about top of the hour. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome all of you. I am Nikki Gamer, Senior Public Affairs Manager for Catholic Relief Services, and I will be your event moderator. And you are here, we are here. This is the official climate change campaign launch for CRS. This is very exciting. We've been working hard on this as we think this is obviously, it's a very important issue to us. A couple of housekeeping things. Number one, you've noticed maybe as you've logged on that you are muted. Okay, we hope that you will stay muted until the question and answer session when you can come off of mute at that point and you can engage with our speakers. Again, we do hope to hear from you. If you have a question that comes up as one of our speakers is talking, you will see at the top of your screen there it should say Q&A. You can pop in your question and we will get to it during the Q&A part of this event. We have 4 speakers and then there's going to be a Q&A section. And so I will just say, if those of you who aren't familiar with CRS, we are the International Humanitarian and Development Organization of the U.S. Catholic Church, and we work in more than 110 countries across the world. We have just released a survey of American attitudes about climate change. We'll be talking about that, and we'll be talking about the issue and how the issue is impacting the communities where we serve. So thank you again for coming. We're really excited, and I'm excited to introduce our very first speaker for you. Bill O'Keefe is the Executive Vice President for CRS, Executive Vice President of Mission, Mobilization, and Advocacy. It is a long title. And, you know, he's really spearheading these efforts. And so I'm really excited for him to speak to all of you. Bill, over to you.
Thanks so much, Nikki, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you with us on this really significant day in the history of CRS. I'm not exaggerating when I say that everywhere CRS works, when you talk to farmers, they will tell you that the climate has changed out from under them. They will describe how the agriculture techniques and the crops that they have used for generations are no longer working as well. They'll describe how the rains have shifted and become more irregular, or either much greater or much less. And they will describe how they and their communities have been impacted by this changing weather. Zooming out, millions of our most vulnerable sisters and brothers are facing increased food insecurity and are being driven from their homes by the ravages of climate change. In fact, the World Bank estimates that if we do nothing to address climate change today, 100 million more people will be pushed into poverty by 2030. With just 8 years left for us to take collective action on climate change before these most devastating effects become irreversible, we must use every day wisely. That's why we're urgently working to ensure people living in poverty, those most impacted by climate change, are able to manage risks, recover, adapt, and build their resilience in the face of this escalating threat. After all, as people of faith, the gospel calls us to care for creation and to hasten the work of shining the light of God's love in the world. CRS is seized by the urgent necessity of responding to climate change because we see not only its direct impacts, but also how it drives conflict, hunger, and migration. In June of this year, I visited Burkina Faso, where I met with bishops, lay leaders, CRS staff and partners, government officials from Burkina Faso and the neighboring Sahelian countries of Mali and Niger. We talked extensively about the escalating violence in the region. There was a coup in Burkina Faso just this week. And I can tell you that the leaders of Burkina Faso and their neighboring countries are clear that the impacts of climate change are stoking tensions between communities and ethnic groups and are aggravating hunger. A recent report from Oxfam documented the link between extreme weather and hunger in 10 climate hotspots, all except one of which are sites of major CRS hunger responses. CRS's global food crisis response is a response to climate change. In the countries most impacted by this terrible global food crisis, the climate crisis is intricately linked. My colleagues Johannes and Leslie are going to share some particular stories and examples from their experience in Guatemala and Ethiopia to make this point. Now, I've been with CRS for 35 years. I've seen drought, I've seen flooding and weather-related disasters, starting in Tanzania, where I worked for CRS in 1987. In the early 1990s, I was directly involved in the drought response in Ethiopia and in East Africa, which for many years has been impacted by cyclical drought. But that was nothing compared to today. Due to climate change, major swaths of East Africa have not had rain for 4 consecutive seasons, and a 5th is already predicted. People and countries cannot recover before the next drought. The leadership at CRS are gravely concerned about the future of these most vulnerable brothers and sisters whom we serve. We still can do something to help our fellow human beings adapt to this changing reality, though. And it's the right thing to do. We have caused this problem that will most impact them. That's why I am so excited to launch this campaign. For the past few years, as some of you may know, we've worked hard to build a movement of Catholics in the US and others of goodwill as well to act on key issues that impact humanity. And we've been doing this through issue-based campaigning, focusing on hunger and migration initially. Our campaigns are designed to support fundraising and advocacy that directly advance the work that CRS is doing around the world. For the launch of this climate change campaign, we are looking to increase the number of people engaged in this movement by inviting Catholics and others of goodwill to join us to contribute financially and commit to taking concrete action, including advocacy throughout the campaign. Part of our goal, as I referenced, is to get our government to do more. And indeed, there are many things the US government can do better to help those impacted by the impacts of climate change. For example, Congress can fund the Green Climate Fund and other mechanisms that support adaptation, clean energy, nature-based solutions, and sustainable landscapes. Our experience informs our support for these programs. One example, which I had the honor of visiting a couple of years ago, is the Spices program in Madagascar. Spices is partially funded by the Green Climate Fund, and it helps farmers learn how to conserve the remaining forests and biodiversity in Madagascar while making a viable living growing spices like vanilla and cinnamon. It's a fantastic example of restoring the balance between human life and the environment in a way where the environment thrives and communities also thrive. So we invite you to help us as we launch this campaign to encourage your readers to subscribe to the campaign online at crs.org/act. and to become involved in climate advocacy generally. On our crs.org website, we have an action center that has a host of tools that invite and allow and enable Catholics and others of goodwill to take meaningful action that will make a difference. You can also write about local efforts to combat climate change in your diocese, including writing about the amazing advocacy that some of our CRS chapters and other groups are doing. Finally, you can encourage your readers to raise funds for organizations like CRS that are on the front lines responding to the needs. As we kick this campaign off, we have a lot of hope. First, in God's mercy and providence and his wisdom and guidance. Second, in the vision and teaching of Pope Francis. Third, in the strength and creativity of our colleagues around the world and our partners in the Caritas network and in other church networks who are every day figuring out how creatively to assist our brothers and sisters. And finally, in the faith and love and action of Catholics and others of goodwill. I want to share some good news about this last point. As Nikki referred to in her introduction, CRS conducted a survey just in August of about 2,000 people, many of whom were Catholic, in order to look at their attitudes towards climate change. And frankly, I am extremely encouraged by what we found, and I think it should give us hope that through this campaign, we can make a difference. It turns out most Americans think immediate action must be taken to limit the impacts of climate change in the US and abroad. And they recognize that the US bears responsibility to help other countries cope. Our survey found that 75% of Americans agree that action must be taken immediately to limit the impacts of climate change within the US, and 69% express the same sentiment when it comes to taking action in other countries. We also found that Catholics are more likely than non-Catholics to be concerned with the impacts of climate change and to express the belief that it deserves a collective response. I frankly am not surprised by that, given our church teaching about the common good and our care for the poor and our Holy Father's leadership in connecting through Laudato Si, the care for our environment and care for vulnerable human beings. It turns out that when asked what words or phrases come to mind when they think of climate change, American Catholics were 5 times more likely to express that climate change is a shared responsibility that requires a collective response. We also found that while most Americans have taken some small steps to counteract their personal impacts on the environment, most are not taking the kinds of significant steps to advance the collective response to climate change. And that's really the opportunity of this campaign, to take this passion and commitment to doing something and helping people to take more concrete, meaningful collective responses that will really impact the core problem. Most Americans are also concerned about the impacts of climate change here and abroad. They are seeing what's happening in Florida, and they are making the connection between the droughts and floods and fires in our own country and the droughts and floods and fires and hurricanes and typhoons in other countries around the world. It's very exciting for us to share these findings and to launch this campaign today. I want to thank you all for coming, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues, and I'm going to turn it back over to you at this point, Nikki. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bill. Great overview and powerful survey results and stories from the field. And relatedly, our next 2 speakers are coming to you from the field. They are on the front lines of the climate crisis in the countries where they work. Our first speaker, I'm so excited he's here to talk to you. We don't often get the opportunity for our staff overseas to talk to U.S. journalists. So it's super exciting for us to have Johannes Subagatas with us. He has a fancy title, the head of climate and agriculture projects in East Africa. but he actually works at restoring degraded land. He oversees a lot of projects in over 15 countries across the continent. And as Bill said, in East Africa right now, there's a record for the worst drought in 40 years. So he's been there, he's been to these countries, and he is here to talk to you about it. Johannes, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nikki. To help us and to help you understand what climate change impact looks like in the Horn of Africa region, I would like to begin with a story actually from my village in northern Ethiopia. This is a mountainous village characterized by steep slopes, deeply dissected by rivers and streams. I belong to an agrarian family, where farming had been followed by many of my ancestors, and still it is a main and a major source of livelihood and income. So when I ask my grandparents about the village, they tell me this community was a very happy community. There were a lot of trees around, and the landscape was beautifully covered with grass. But as I have gotten older, I have seen drought and floods become more frequent and severe. And through the years, it was sad to notice, the big change in the village. The land has been greatly damaged. A lot of soil has been washed away, and that has taken away the fertile part of it. And what that it means is whatever that has grown there is also damaged. And this, as a result of this land produce very little today. This puts farming at risk to be a viable livelihood option, in the village, leaving the community helpless. So Ethiopia is located in the Horn of Africa, a region in the easternmost part of Africa that includes countries like Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Eritrea. So the Horn of Africa has become, as Bill referenced, one of the world's region most vulnerable to climate change. Actually, 3 out of 4 people living in this region in poverty rely on agriculture and natural resources to survive, which is both of them are very sensitive to climate change impacts. While the impact of climate change affects every country on every continent, as we know, they don't do it equally. When climate change meets poverty, as it is in the Horn of Africa, it is kind of perfect storm of challenges. The Horn of Africa, as it has been referenced, is currently going through 4 straight failed rain seasons. This is the worst drought within 40 years. The upcoming rain season is also expected to fail, according to many prediction centers. As a result, sadly, in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia particularly, we are on the brink of unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe, affecting estimated over 22 million people. That is the equivalent of filling every seat of every NFL football stadium here in the United States 11 times over. So climate change impacts are clearly worsening for the poorest and most vulnerable people, who lives in vast, neglected rural hinterlands where there is no safety net, where people cannot afford tools or technology that are needed to improve their farmlands in the face of constant drought and heat waves happening every day. But there is great hope in the work of organizations like CRS. CRS is working in the Horn of Africa to address life-threatening impacts of climate change before, during, and after crisis. For example, in Ethiopia, CRS is supporting vulnerable communities with life-saving humanitarian assistance, so people have enough food to eat and water to drink to survive a drought. But also to address the long-term needs, CRS is helping communities through enhanced climate change adaptation programs. Take, for example, our early warning system, which we provide through radio broadcasting and text message. If a weather forecast predicts a dry spell, farmers will get messages with weather updates, which helps them prepare better for the oncoming drought by switching, say, for example, from long cycle to short cycle crops. So this type of program can be really life-saving for the millions of families who rely on the land to earn a living. For the majority of people in the Horn of Africa, even the slightest change in the weather can mean life or death. So the science is actually clear. Global greenhouse gas emissions are not slowing enough to prevent short-term disasters and hardship for people on the front lines of climate crisis, like what we are talking about in the Horn of Africa, for example. So that is why actually we need to redouble our investment in climate smart agricultural practices, in land restoration practices, water conservation practices. We also need great support for safety net system and for water storage and efficient systems. So finally, as we all hear through different news outlets, today many parts of the world are deeply food and water insecure. All of them are worsened by climate change. For our collective future, then, it is imperative to join in to accelerate humanity's transition to climate-safe world. So it is high time to support enhanced climate change adaptation efforts for most vulnerable communities in the Horn of Africa, but also elsewhere. Thank you, and back to you, Nikki.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Johannes. Powerful testimony. I've never been, haven't been able to be to some of those countries. So it's so great to have you here with us to talk about your experiences. Relatedly, our last speaker, Leslie Perez, she is amazing. She comes to us from Guatemala, where she is the chief of party and works with a lot of the communities in rural areas. And again, I'm so glad she is here to share her stories. Leslie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to bring more inputs to this conversation about what is happening. And I will start with the next slide. First, sharing how we are experiencing climate change. In Guatemala, sometimes it rains more than expected, and sometimes doesn't rain at all. This is how we are experiencing climate change here. In every year, we've been seeing more rain and also more frequent and stronger storms. Particularly in 2020, we were suffering the effects of two tropical storms who impacted us very severely and damaged production, lands, houses. It was a very difficult situation, but I would like to share this story of one of the communities where we work. And I'll continue with the first slide, sharing that this community is located in the northern part of Guatemala. It's the community of Chortis. In this community is in the very high parts of the mountains, and it's a place where there is no electricity, no water systems, a very vulnerable community. And this was one of the communities severely impacted by these two tropical storms that we experienced in Guatemala, the strongest in 1 decade, in 2 decades, the strongest in 2 decades. When these storms happened in this community, the first thing that happened is that all the crops, potato crops, were destroyed. And because of high humidity and the weather, their animals were also killed. They were producing potato, sheep, and goats. And these were their main sources of income. And without these main sources of income, they were not able to feed their children, and they weren't also able to pay for seeds or fertilizers to begin their production again. So when this happened, some weeks after the storms, our teams visited these families in Chortis, And we had the opportunity to meet Mrs. Serapia, who you are seeing in this picture. And she shared with us that their major concern, their major need was accessing food. And I am happy to say that by that time, CRS responded quickly with food inputs, and also hygiene inputs. But what concerns me is that this situation can happen again, will happen again, and might be happening as I am speaking in this conversation with you. So in the next slide, we'll see Mr. Francisco Lopez. We also met him in the same visit. And I wanted to take the opportunity to bring his words to this conversation. He told us in that occasion that these words that you're seeing, he told us we don't have other sources of income. We don't have electricity. We don't have access to safe water. We walk 3 hours on slippery roads to come to our village. But our biggest challenge is that we have been forgotten. And his words are on my mind since then, and I cannot forget his words, and also I cannot stop thinking how challenging the situation for families in this community and in other communities in Guatemala and other countries in Latin America are. And this story can show us what we heard from Bill at the beginning, that the poorest families, the most vulnerable, are the ones paying the hardest consequences of climate change. They are the ones using less resources without basic services, but they are the ones experiencing losing everything every time an event originated by climate change happens. So with this, I believe that, or I'm convinced that climate change is a global responsibility. I was very happy to see in our survey that youth is demonstrating to be concerned about climate change, and they are the ones demanding change. I believe that youth attitude towards climate change is a model, or can be a model for all of us. Personally, I am concerned about the situation. I'm concerned about the current situation and also the future. I have 2 nieces, and one of them, the older one, is 16. And I was trying to imagine the future. By the year 2050, she's going to be my age. And according to the Ministry of Natural Resources in Guatemala, by that year, 80% of the geographic territory in Guatemala is going to be experiencing high or very high threats of droughts. So I was thinking, how is life going to be for my niece by then? And going back to the Chortiz community, how is life going to be for the children in Chortiz by then? So with this story, I just learned about climate change, that climate change is it's a problem that is behind different threats that families are living. Climate change is behind migration, behind poverty, behind food insecurity and hunger. And we are seeing that with Johannes, we are sharing the same stories. And from my learnings, I would like just to highlight that besides being urgent, climate change is a shared responsibility that demands a response for the current situation, for short term, but also it demands actions for the long term. So this is what I've been seeing in Guatemala through our work, and this is what I've been learning about climate change. And I really appreciate the opportunity of sharing this situation with you all. So thank you so much, Nikki, and back to you.
I can totally relate, Leslie, your story of your nieces. I have 4 nephews, and I think of it often. What are we leaving them, right? So thank you so much for sharing really powerful stories. I want to invite all of our speakers to come back on camera. And I'm hoping now we turn it over to our amazing press corps who are here, hopefully listening with urgency. Bill said we really hope you are engaged on this and think about writing about this issue, writing about our campaign, and I want to start, maybe, looks like Bill has a question, not Bill O'Keefe. Another Bill had a question that says, let's see, are South Sudan and Burkina Faso also experiencing drought? And maybe I'll invite Johannes to answer that.
So is the question if South Sudan and Burkina Faso is also facing drought? Yeah, definitely. I mean, like the extent now, like when we look at the greater Horn of Africa, which South Sudan is also a part of, like the extent is really intensive in partly like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia, but South Sudan too is experiencing. And this experience is across the Sahel. So that Sahel impact extends to there. And I have an opportunity to visit Niger, our program in Niger, and like that, which is not far from Burkina Faso. So yeah, there is also huge impact and like very directly like relatable like with the climate change impact, the drought and the climate change impact. Yes.
Great, thank you. Relatedly, and I have to think this is Bill Lambers, who I'm so glad joined us, has another question. How do the Mcgovern Dole projects in Burkina and Guatemala help with coping with climate change? I don't know, Leslie, you're shaking your head if you want to respond to that, or Bill.
Bill, I can start by saying that the work in CRS in Guatemala, in that sense, is closely related to assisting students at school level by distributing inputs, by also bringing educational material. During these 2 years, 3 years experiencing the pandemic and also the impacts of the climate change, this was a key element to sustain families because classes or schools were closed. But even then, students continue coming to the schools because of the opportunity of receiving assistance for their family. So it was a key element, I believe, to keep strong links also between the community and also the participation of children to the school while they were studying from home.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Bill, go ahead.
Can I just add really quickly? I mean, I think one of the great things about the Mcgovern Dole program, which for those of you not familiar is a USDA sponsored program of international school feeding that CRS effectively uses in a whole community effort. And frequently in our Mcgovern Dole programs, we are strengthening the ability of the school and the families to grow their own food and to have kitchen gardens and things like that, which contributes to the resilience of the community as it faces climate change. They're not directly necessarily climate change responses, but they contribute to building the resilience of the community in a super important way, particularly for children.
Yeah, see, a lot of these programs have so many links into the climate, right? Whether they're health or school feeding programs, everything seems to have be affected by what's happening. Brittany, I think you had a question come through the Q&A.
Yeah, I did. I actually have two. The first one is from Ann Rogers. She's from Pittsburgh Catholic. She's asked, most of our many thousands of local people there, often low-income families, rely on their income from this. Do we have any advice on how to talk to these folks about greenhouse gases and climate change without judging or alienating them? Bill, you might be best to answer this question.
So Brittany, you cut out for a second. Would you mind just repeating the beginning of the question?
Yeah, it's from Ann Rogers. She's with Pittsburgh Catholic. She says most of their diocese is in fracking territory, and many thousands of local people, often low-income families, rely on income from this. So do we have any advice on how to talk to these people in particular about greenhouse gases and climate change without judging or alienating them?
That's a fantastic question, super important question. And one of the things in general we're working on in the campaign is to build bipartisan support for strong climate action, because we know that we're in the process of a transition, and that it's going to be really important that all of us participate. My advice is, and I think this is where CRS can be helpful, our role is to say there are philosophical debates, but in the 110 countries where we're operating, the climate is changing. And so we have to face up to that reality. And that's why we're testifying and bearing witness to what we're seeing around the world, and why committed colleagues like Johannes and Leslie are here sharing their examples and their stories, because they're just two of thousands of our staff who could say the same or similar stories about the experience of the poor and vulnerable around the world. It doesn't make it any easier, this transition, and it is something our society has to figure out. We're not the experts on domestic climate policy, but we are the experts in saying this problem is real. It's happening to people around the world. We believe the science that Pope Francis has also adopted and his teaching, and we urge strong climate action.
Thank you, Bill. I definitely agree. I have one more from Dennis Sadowski with Catholic News Service. If I could ask Dennis a question. I think it looks like he just rejoined us. He might have had a connection problem. So Dennis, your question was, I'm interested in learning more about how the campaign will engage people in the pews, so to speak. How or are people ready to step up and advocate? How will they know what steps to take?
Maybe I can start. So the campaign is an opportunity to join, as I said, crs.org/act, to join in an organized effort that provides education, stories, examples, and then sequenced, well-planned actions that people can take that really make it possible and even easy for people to take concrete action in the pews. And so we're encouraging people to sign up, and then the rest is history. You know, our campaign is designed to provide them with what they need in order to make a difference. For those who want to really go deeper, we are also building chapters and clubs in high schools and in colleges and in parishes. I referred to that a little bit in my remarks. And those groups are going deeper with us, studying the problem, and also taking more actions, meeting with their legislators, writing letters to the editor, and engaging policymakers in a direct dialogue, and showing that they, as Catholics in the United States, really do care. And we'd love to work with parishes and dioceses on forming new chapters and joining our leaders already who are so committed in this work.
Looks like relatedly, Ashley Hand, thank you for this question. I think, Bill, again to you, are there specific fundraising goals that you believe are necessary to have an impact on climate change in these countries? And how would the funds be used?
That's a really great question and a really complicated one. So I'll unpack it hopefully quickly. First, in terms of support for CRS programs and our agricultural programs that are really climate smart and helping people adapt, and also for our disaster risk reduction, where we're helping those impacted by climate disasters to be more resilient so that they're not their lives are not completely turned topsy-turvy when something does happen that's caused by the climate. We actually do have some fundraising targets that we're trying to raise. I don't have them off the top of my head, and we'll have to get back to you with them, Ashley, but it's a great question. In terms of our advocacy, as part of the Paris Climate Accord, our government and others around the world agreed to provide $100 billion per year in climate funding for the most vulnerable, for the problem, half of which for adaptation. Right now, less than 20 billion is being provided per year for that. And so that's why we are advocating for the Green Climate Fund and as a matter of fact, more support to climate funding and climate finance. It's there's a long way between what's being provided and what the needs our needs are going to be. And there's been some interesting coverage around the Florida disaster and hurricane about this is just the tip of the iceberg of what climate adaptation is going to require in the United States. And you can imagine that in the communities where we're working, while it's much cheaper to do anything, folks are going to be much more impacted.
A long way to go on that front. So more voices, the better on the adaptation piece. I want to go to Kevin Clark's question. Welcome, Kevin. It's great to see you here. He has an interesting question that I think would be good for Leslie, because she did reference young people in her remarks. And so I'd be curious, Leslie, what you would say to this. Kevin says, young people seem especially gloomy and pessimistic about the future in our survey. And he sees on Twitter some people saying they're not preparing for the future since they don't expect one. Are we doomsaying them into immobility? That's a good question.
Nikki, the last part of the question, please, can you?
Yeah. So by amplifying this idea that young people are fearful of the future, are we kind of pushing them toward that fate? Are we doomsaying? So they're just going to say, well, why bother, right? So yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, two ideas that come to my mind is that there are very visible examples of youth leading movements to bring messages for everyone. So these can be the models for other youth. I think that bringing information for them is important because there are many distractions. Pope Francis cited this in the Laudato Si. So many distractions for youth, so many comfortable situations engaged in social networks, etc. But sharing this information, using these movements led by youth to be example for other youth in our participant communities, but also in the US, I believe that can be a good action to share the message of how others are concerned, are acting, and also demanding change. This is the idea that comes to my mind, Nikki.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And our survey, according to our survey, I want to say millennials and Gen Z are like 12 times more likely to say that they participated in collective action, like supporting an organization like CRS or things like that. So I think there is hope in the survey as well in terms of what young people are doing more than people in my generation, which I will not share what that is. But so I found some great optimism in some of what was in that report.
Agree.
Yeah. Brittany, I know you said there's another question that came in on the Q&A.
Yeah, I have actually 3 questions that are in the Q&A side of things. The first one from Brian from National Catholic Reporters Earthbeat. Advocacy of the U.S. government was mentioned as one of the main pillars of our climate change campaign. What interactions has CRS had on climate policy issues? And does the campaign have specific asks or expectations for the U.S. and other countries to take at the forthcoming COP27 United Nations Climate Change Summit? Brian says he knows that the Green Climate Fund was mentioned specifically, but he's curious if there are other specific priorities for CRS and our African partners specifically, since the conference is being held in Egypt this year.
I can take a stab at that. And that, again, multifaceted question. Let me, and if I forget parts of it, just help me out. But so we do have specific asks, and I think those specific asks will also develop over the life of the campaign. But right now it's funding for the and meeting our commitments, which we've already made on the Green Climate Fund, and also funding. There's some other parts of our of the annual appropriations process that are climate sensitive or climate smart accounts that help poor people around the world, vulnerable people to adapt. Sorry. We're also right now working on the Global Food Security Act, which just actually passed in the House, the reauthorization of the act, and is in the Senate. And in addition to some of the really good general agricultural practices that we're advancing through that, we've been working to make that bill more climate smart and to encourage more climate smart agriculture, water smart agriculture, nature-based agriculture, and have succeeded in getting some language in the bill that we're advancing. So we're inviting people to join us, particularly in pushing the Senate to move that bill and pass it by the end of this Congress. That's what we're working on right now. Between now and December, we're working on our agenda for the upcoming legislative year in the new Congress. And you may have heard there's an election coming up. And so how exactly that shapes out, we'll have to see. But more importantly, we're really trying to take the long view and look at what is the U.S. government's policy towards adaptation and what's the set of recommendations that we can make. And we're doing some research right now to get to the bottom of that. At COP27, we're going to have a couple of people there. Nikki's actually going to be there as well. And if you're interested, just put in a plug for her. If you're interested in covering what we're doing there, Nikki would be a great one to stay in touch with. But we have a couple of folks who are working on climate advocacy and policy who are going to be, as part of the Caritas Network's global climate effort, going to be advocating for addressing this big issue of what's called loss and damage, the compensating of countries that are most affected by the crisis by those who have most caused it when indeed they suffer some sort of disaster. I think I got all the parts of the question.
Yeah, and Brian, we actually have a case study on loss and damage we're going to be putting out for at the COP, and we're actually going to be one of our colleagues from Madagascar is going to be at the COP presenting this case study in partnership with Caritas, our Caritas partners. So that's pretty exciting, and we can tell you more about that. I'd love for you to think about writing about it. Brittany, I think is there one more question, and then we can wrap it up?
I have 2 more. I have another question from Ann Rogers with Pittsburgh Catholic. Bill, again, you might be the best person posed to answer this one. She's asking, can you describe a bit more of what this climate change campaign will look like? Is it primarily social media? parish communications? What does it ask of dioceses in terms of communication channels?
Thanks. Great. It is actually all of the above. We have a strong social media component, which is starting today. And we have, as I said, for those who sign up, and we are reaching out to all dioceses in the United States and welcoming them in. We already have been doing that, actually. And in order to encourage more people to sign up and join us, we have about 75,000 people, I think, on our network already, and we're trying to build that. Most of those people are faithful Catholics in dioceses and parishes. And as I said, those folks will be just connected to the stream of activity that will allow them to take meaningful action and really deep dive into this crisis and how they can help. And, we're also developing a set of resources for priests, and we'll be, as part of our discussions with bishops around the country, talking about this issue, which we know many are concerned about as well. And we're so blessed at CRS to have the support of our of the bishops of the United States and their love and concern for their brothers and sisters around the world. And I think are looking forward to working with them to engage folks in this really important job.
Thanks, Bill. So I have one more question from Brian. It's a follow-up to Dennis's earlier question about how we're going to engage people in the pews. Brian's asking, have there been any discussions about ways to engage diocesan workers, et cetera, in this campaign? Brian says he's thinking of some of the collections that dioceses and parishes or something similar around the issue of climate change as a way to bring this conversation into the churches, especially since our survey seems to show a high level of concern and engagement on climate change among Americans and Catholics.
That's fantastic.
He said,
idea.
Bill, that you did address most of his questions response,
Yeah.
but if you have anything that you want to extend on.
Well, I just want to thank him for a couple of really good ideas. I think, there's the American Catholics, the bishops are so generous when it comes to natural disasters. And I think as dioceses hold collections for, let's say, the response in Florida or in Cuba, where CRS is active, or in Dominican Republic after Hurricane Fiona, or for Guatemala and other countries, or for East Africa, that they make those connections, and we can help them do this between the root cause of climate and the impact on people. And I think sometimes it's one of the tricky things with climate. Sometimes we fail to make that connection for people. So it seems like there's this kind of unrelated stream of disasters, but there's a thread, and that thread is climate change. And so we need to draw that thread I'm mixing my metaphors. We need to connect that thread. We need to weave that cloth. And I think that's part of all of our job.
Great. Wow, great questions. I really appreciate that, because you can work on things in a vacuum, and it's really great to hear from the Catholic Press Corps on this, who, by the way, you are so important to what we are doing and what we will do in the future. Earthbeat, amazing environmental resource. Brian Rowe, so glad you're here too. All right, we are about out of time, wrapping up. I just want to say thank you to Leslie and Johannes. Thank you so much for bringing the stories from the fields to us, to all of you. Thank you to all of you for coming. Bill, thank you for spearheading these efforts. And I do want to put a plug. You say, well, how can I cover this for my diocese? We put together a press kit. But we have photos, we have video resources. You can email us. We have staff in different parts of the U.S. you can talk to and try to make it more relevant to your particular readership. And don't forget, we have a climate change reporting fellowship. This is very exciting. Applications are due October 22nd. Mark that on your calendar. If you have not put in your application yet, do not forget to. It's exciting. We're going to go to Honduras, Leslie's neck of the woods. Unfortunately, we're not going to Guatemala this year, but if it's successful, maybe next year, so that you all can see, or the fellows can see firsthand what this is doing to communities and bring those stories back to your readers. So thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate it that you came. And if you have questions about anything you heard, email me, email Brittany, email Bill, and then we can put you in touch with Leslie and Johannes as well, if that would be helpful to you in your reporting. So thank you so much for coming. And yeah, I want to help you all have a great rest of your day, and let's be in touch going forward. Thank you so much. Bye. Bye, everyone. It's weird to end an event online because you don't know what, you don't have people to talk to.